Kia ora koutou, everyone who doesn't know me, my name is Craig Renney. Apologies for the accent up front. I'm the Director of Policy and Economist for the CTU, for the Council of Trade Unions, Te Kawe Kaimahi. That's my day job. By night, I spend my time on Twitter annoying the National Party, and in particular Nicola Willis. I'm here to talk about what's happening in the economy and the budget, what the budget numbers tell us about what's happening in the economy, and basically what we might choose to do as a consequence. If at any point in time I use a term or I say something that doesn't make any sense to you, ask. Economists have to use fancy terms to justify our suits, right? So it's definitely me, not you, right? Two, if at any point in time you walk out of here and you go, I wish I'd asked that question, right? My email address is craigr@nzctu.org.nz. It's on the website. Ask. Yeah? I get paid to do this, right? I'm the luckiest person in the world, right? So, I work for the trade union movement. Ask me, and I'll answer your question. Yeah? So, without any further ado, I want to talk to you about the budget. Now, during the budget period, you might have heard the phrase, so in the election period, you might have heard the phrase, it's time to get the country back on track.
Only 1,000 times.
And after 1 year ago, the National Party prepared a document online that said that under its management, it was focused on delivering real, tangible results to improve the lives of all New Zealanders. Got one question for you. Do you feel back on track yet? How do you think that's going? So, thankfully, there are some numbers in the budget that might, give you pause to think. Yeah. So this is job seeker numbers. Now the government has a target. It wanted to get 50,000 people off job seekers. Yeah. When the government took office, there were about 170,000 people on job seekers. And if we look at what was forecast at the elections, this blue line, this represents what was forecast at the budget, the total number of people on job seekers. You see, a little over 170,000 in 2023. And it rose just under 200,000. Yeah? This is what it was at the last budget, the budget 2024. Yeah? So it rose a little bit more, another great deal more, 205,000. Yeah, it was its peak. This is what it is this budget. It rises to 221,000. Cumulatively across the forecast period, there are an extra 61,000 people on job seekers. Right? And the total number now rises a little over 220,000. So rather than going down by 50,000, the number of people on job seekers has now gone up by 50,000. If we want to reach the government's target, we now need to get 100,000 people off job seekers. Something we've never done as a country. But that's just job seekers. That's just one. I'm a data nerd. You can find one data point that doesn't work, right? So what about wages? We sort of care about wages. So this is what wages are going to have to do according to this budget. So this is the median full-time equivalent, so 40 hours, wage. Yeah? Median just means the one in the middle. Yeah? Now, 71,000, currently rising across the forecast period to a little over 72,000, 72,224 if you want to be exact, but it's a forecast, so it's not, it won't be there. Now this is what it does at the last budget. So what you can see is the full-time median wage has fallen between those two budgets. It's actually fallen by $983. So that tax cut that you got in 2023 has just disappeared. Because wages aren't rising as quickly as people were forecasting. Wages aren't rising as quickly and there are more people unemployed. So the labour market's not too well, right? It's not doing so well. Okay, well, that's the labour market, it's the National Party, we bake in more people being unemployed. Yeah? So GDP, right? This was getting the country back on track. This is what we were told, the country was out of control, we needed firm discipline, we were going to get things back on track, get things moving again. Yeah?
Can I just ask for an explanation of GDP?
Sure.
I don't understand.
Gross domestic product, invented by Simon Kuznets in 1935. It's an entirely useless measure of absolutely anything, but we use it all the time, right? Measures absolutely nothing of any value, right? All it does is it just adds up all of the economic activity that takes place in the country during that period of time. Kuznets actually invented it because the US wanted to measure to work out whether or not the then Soviet economy was growing more quickly than the American economy. And Kuznets famously said a measure not being very bad. But that's the thing that we use. He did. He did. And he hated it. And it was it was actually a New Deal program because he was paid by the New Deal, the American New Deal at the time, to actually go away and invent this. And ever since then, we've used this measure, right? Because you measure production, output, and investment. GDP, 3 types of GDP. So this is GDP at this budget, this blue line, right? And this is real GDP. So we've stripped out inflation out of the state, okay? So as you can see, 280 billion miles across the forecast period to a little about 350 billion. Yeah, okay. So that's what it was at the budget before. Fallen just a little bit from the budget before. Yeah? You remember getting back on track. This is what it was at the election. There's about $38 billion of missing output across the forecast period. That's about $5,000 per household. Do you feel back on track yet?
No.
So that's GDP. Yeah? But again, GDP, short periods of time, right? You should probably look at this over longer periods of time. And because I'm an intensely sad person, I can show you long-term GDP since 1990. You know, who can you remember who was in charge between 1990 and 1993? And that's what GDP looked like under Ruth Richards. 3% growth over 3 years. Yeah? Again, this is real GDP growth with stripped inflation out. Terrible result, and then we see growth return, and then we see some Michael Collins growth. This one here, that's the GFC. It's the GFC period. Yeah? Growth basically disappeared for 3 years. Then the English growth, then Frank Robertson growth, and this is Nicola Willison's 3 years growth. But that's the Treasury's forecast. And the Treasury's forecast is probably the most optimistic forecast of any of the forecasts going forward. If I was to use the Reserve Bank's forecast, it would be there. And the Reserve Bank's forecast is more optimistic than the OECD and the IMF. Right? What you can see is that if you use the Reserve Bank's forecast, this is the lowest period of growth in any 3-year period outside of the GFC. Yeah, since Ruth Richards. So, why are we not growing? This budget was literally called, the front page of the budget was called the growth budget. The government's economic development strategy is called Going for Growth. Why are we growing so little?
We've made some of our best workers redundant and they've gone overseas.
So all of these things, essentially, those numbers I showed you at the very beginning, the unemployment numbers, yeah? No people being unemployed. Everyone's terrified about where their next dollar is coming from. Right? Where's the next job coming from? Right? When that happens, people keep their hands firmly in their pockets. When they keep their hands firmly in their pockets, they don't then go and spend money in the local shops, they don't go and spend money in the local economy. Businesses don't invest because they're not seeing a stream of income coming towards them. When they don't invest, we don't create jobs. If we don't create jobs, people go, where's the next job coming from? And we go round and round and round this cycle. We have 250 recorded years of economic history. We can do this over and over again. Right? The policies that we have right now are the exact opposite of what 250 years of economic history would tell you to do. Right? But don't take my word for it, right? Let's look. But when we say, okay, so let's take the politics out of this for a second, in that long run chart. Yeah? Please.
Well,
Of course.
you say GDP, and I've heard your explanation of this twice. One, is there something, a better model that you propose to say? Because one thing with GDP, that John Key government thing, right, was immigration growth.
Kiwis are, it's a great question. Kiwis love using GDP per capita, which is a much better measure, right? So having just purpose, right? GDP per capita now, today, is lower than what it was in May 2022. So we've had no growth in GDP per capita for 3 years. right? If you ask yourself the question, okay, well that's GDP per capita, right? What's a better measure, right, of this, right? To me, the best measure is child poverty.
This one?
Child poverty. We have 3 indicators of child poverty in this country, right? Before housing, after housing, and material poverty. And the really important one there is material poverty. Yeah? We have 156,900 children who live in material poverty in New Zealand, right? That means they don't have 2 pairs of shoes. They don't have a winter coat. They regularly don't have 2 meals a day with a source of protein. They live in cold, mouldy housing. Do you know how we measure mould in housing in New Zealand? Whether or not the mould in your property is larger than the size of A4. They regularly don't go to the doctors and the dentists because someone in the family can't afford to go. In a country as wealthy as New Zealand, that's a sin. And I say that advisedly in this building. Yeah? But that to me is the best measure. That's why when I went to Jacinda Ardern, we were so focused on child poverty. But right or wrong, that's the GDP measure. I say this because National likes to campaign on the fact that it's the good economic manager, right? That it knows what it's doing, yeah? In the long run data tells us this. When the national GDP grows, on average, in real terms, over the past 30 years, at 2.1% a year. Yeah? Under the red team, it grows at 3.4% a year. Again, we've taken inflation out of this data. When we invest in this country, we grow, unsurprisingly. When we back ourselves, we grow. Wages go up, people spend money, everyone's a little bit happy. Yeah? Yet somehow we keep going back to the same message that we need to cut our way to prosperity. So, let's look at the business investment data that we have. So, the government launched at this budget a tax package, $6.7 billion, and it's called Investment Boost, and it will give businesses back some of the tax that they pay when they buy an asset. So 20% of the asset they'll be able to write off against their tax right at the beginning, right? Everything from double cab utes to oil rigs, right? I suggest if you own a Ford, double cab ute sales place, a car yard, right? The Raptor package is going to get the absolute treatment this year because 20% of your double cab ute could be written off against your tax, right? But this is business investments at the last budget. Yeah, so we're at 14% across the forecast period. Yeah? $6.7 billion tax cut for businesses to help support growth. And this is business investment at this budget. It's 20% lower. What we're seeing is that lack of confidence in the labour market, that lack of confidence in the economy, meaning businesses don't invest. Businesses don't invest, we don't create jobs, people get a lack of confidence, and we go round and round and round the cycle. Yeah? So that's business investment, but it's not all bad news. I'm a professional economist, right? I can professionally depress a room from 250 paces, right? It's called the dismal science for a reason, right? But it's not all clouds, right? Because house prices are going up. House prices are going to go, according to the Treasury, 6% a year over the forecast period. By the end of it, your house price will go up 25%, right? But this is wages. Wages goes up at half the rate. We're going back to 2015. Adele is going to play a lot on the radio, right? But 2015. What we saw was an economy where the fastest way to make money was to own somebody else's home. And that's what we're going to go back to, right? Where you get to write off the cost of your interest against your tax, right? You get to write off the cost of maintenance against your tax, and you get all the profits tax-free. Housing's mad in New Zealand, right? Housing is the only asset where you can legitimately take somebody else's money, who's the bank. You can make somebody else pay the bank back, who's the tenant, and you get all the cash at the end, tax-free. You're mad if you don't do it. And that's what we're heading back to on that basis. Now, during the election campaign, we were told regularly that part of the reason we needed to change was because we had too much debt. We borrowed too much money, we needed restraint. It was time for us to discipline. Borrowed a lot of cash, we're paying a lot of it. Right? So at the election, this is net core prime debt as a percentage of GDP. We use this measure because this is the internationally comparable measure. Yeah? So as you can see, net core prime debt rising to a little bit more than 23% of GDP. Now, if I did this measure in Australia, it would be 30%. If I did this in the UK, it would be 92%. If I did this in the US, it would be 95. If I did this in Japan, it would be 150. But New Zealand has a debt problem. Anyway, that's net core prime debt as a percentage of GDP. Right? So, after cutting everything in sight, yeah, this is net core prime debt in December last year, where we saw net core prime debt rise to 26% GDP. And then in this budget, we see net core prime debt, which is the green line, you see it just ends the end of 2029 higher than where we were in December last year. So after all those cuts, after all those changes, for all the things we stopped, debt is still higher as a percentage of GDP than it was supposed to be back when debt was out of control at the election. Now, why is that the case? Because this is debt against GDP, and it's two sides of the ledger. And because GDP isn't growing, we're not saying debt to GDP, the nominal number is the same, but the percentage doesn't fall. Yeah? Why isn't GDP growing? Because no one has any confidence, because the government cut all the spending, because we got rid of all the investment, and the government told us we had to stop spending money. When we stopped spending money, we stopped spending money in local shops, people got laid off, and we went round and round and round the cycle. Do you feel back on track yet?
No.
So, next point, this is really important. Forecast CPI, so Consumer Price Index. This is just inflation when it's talked about, in general terms. At the last election, that was the forecast from the Treasury, the pre-election economic fiscal update of CPI change across the forecast period. Yeah? Started off about 4.5%, rose, it's going to go gently down to 2% by August 2027. Yeah? Now, in December, that was the forecast track. You can see national cut inflation. Yeah? It goes back to that. Okay. Right. What about now? Inflation's starting to rise again. And you can actually see where we are now. In June, inflation is essentially where we were back when inflation was out of control at the election. But hang on a second, this is the Treasury. Yeah? Maybe they're the most optimistic people. In fact, the Reserve Bank, that's the Reserve Bank's figure. And you can see inflation now starting to be higher than where we were at the last election. So all those cuts, all those things that we did to bring the cost of living down, and inflation is higher than where we were tracking to be at the election. And all of this is before, and I say this carefully, we have an orange-faced baboon currently in charge, right, in the White House, right, and I never thought I'd have a conversation in Tauranga about the Straits of Hormuz in the Gulf. But if they close the Straits of Hormuz, currently you can go and buy a barrel, if you really want to, of West Texas Intermediate oil, $75 US. If they close the Straits of Hormuz, that'll be 110. That will make 4 quart 91, $3.50, $3.75. That will mean inflation will be out of control. Right? Oil's rising again. So all those changes, and we are essentially back to where we thought we were going to be at the election. So let's build a budget together. I don't know about you. Very sad story about me. I saw my first budget when I was 9 years old. Yeah, I watched the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, deliver the very bad 1988 UK budget. By the time I was 12, I knew what I wanted to do for a living, which is write a budget. Right? I've written 3. Yeah. Now, budgets are really hard, it's very complicated, but they're actually in their core very simple. It's just money in and money out. Yeah? So let's look at the money coming in. $2.1 billion a year of what are called other savings initiatives, which is Treasury code for cuts. So because of the magic of the Public Finance Act, we multiply all these numbers by 4, because there are 4 forecast years. Yeah? So $2.1 billion becomes $8.4 billion of cuts. On top of the $24 billion of cuts we saw at the last budget. We generate a little bit more revenue, $600 million more revenue. That's mainly things like fuel duty, road user charge, and other things they go every year on an escalator. But then, $2.7 billion we steal from pay equity. And then we have the budget allowance on top, which is $1.3 billion, and we get to $6.7 billion of new money that's available to the government. Yeah? Now, what happens? First thing we do is we chuck $1.7 billion of it straight back out in tax cuts. Those are the investment boost programs. And we canned the proposed digital services tax. So, digital services tax on companies like Facebook, Google, Meta, others. $500 million across the forecast period, we just went, nope, we're not doing that anymore. Because an orange-faced baboon was throwing a tantrum in the White House about it, so we said we're not going to do that. So, then we spend $5 billion of it. Right? So, outside of health, right, the biggest expenses are defense, police, corrections. That's it. In fact, if we look at where there are cuts at this budget, say this. If you work in agriculture, biosecurity, fisheries, food safety, arts, culture, heritage, building and construction, courts, customs, environment, marine development, Pacific Peoples, social development, sports and recreation, there are only cuts at this budget. $1.5 billion comes from social development. Right? In the middle of a building crisis, when we've lost 15,000 construction workers, mainly to Australia, we're cutting $188 million out of building and construction. But that's day-to-day spending, right? What about the stuff that's quite important? Capital investment, the physical stuff, schools, hospitals, roads, the stuff that, define us as a country, right? Well, so this was budget 23, $65 billion thereabouts, over the next 5 years of capital investment. Yeah? That was the capital investment intention. Then at budget 24 last year, that fell to $57 billion. And then at this budget, it falls again to $50.5 billion. We're investing less and less and less, and we're expecting the private sector essentially to fill that gap. Because we're not going to do it because the public-private partnerships will pay for it. Right? And do you know what's not in these books at all?
Votes.
There are no votes. This is I'm not going to test your eyesight. This is the Treasury's statement about the Cook Strait ferries. As you can see, dot, 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 there's no money. We also have a boat, I can highly recommend it, the HMS NZ Manamanui. It's a lovely vessel, and it's nestling gently on a coral reef, about 30 meters underwater. Right? We have no plans to do anything with it. In about 10 years' time, we'll make an amazing dive zone. Right? But we don't want to replace it. No, anything else with it. And so we have no boats at all. If you're a country made up of 2 islands and you don't have a ferry service between those 2 islands, you're not a proper country. So, no boats. But what else about business support is in there? This was a government that was elected because it was going to get business moving. It's going to get staff down, right? Business support during the middle of downturn is really important spending. It's stuff you should be doing. Yeah? R&D, innovation, small business support. And to its credit, this spent $500 million, $500 million on new business investment programs. Yeah? Now the eagle-eyed of you will notice next to it is another column that says international film subsidies. How much of that $500 million is international film subsidies? I'll put you up in the three. $571 million of a $500 million package is international film subsidies, meaning that actual net investment in business support is minus $71 million. Because we closed Callahan, we closed the R&D programs. And as a consequence, again, in the middle of a recession, in the middle of a downturn in the economy, we stopped doing the things that will support the next round of growth. But Warner Brothers, right, we're making money filming in New Zealand, because that's international film subsidies. There's actually no subsidy at all for domestic production. So, what about health and education for the stuff we actually all care about? Yeah? Well, health is $2 billion according to ASMS and the CTU. ASMS is the Senior Medical Doctors Union. Yeah? And that's just to keep the lights on. Because the cost of living goes up, we've got to pay a bit more money for more electricity, population goes up, we need to put more money. $2 billion. Health law, $1.37 billion in cost of living funding, and they've got $1.7 billion in total in new money. Yeah? So that's all the new programs, everything else. What that means is there are new programs that have been announced but not actually receiving any money. So that $50 million for private sector firms to do more hips, knees, and the things, great. That has to come out of the cost of living money. So that's just like a cut to health funding, because you're asking it to do more with the same amount of money. And then in education received a 1.5% increase in what we call the schools operation grant. That's the money they get for day-to-day stuff. Yeah? Now, inflation is currently 2.6%. You don't need to be a professor of economics to know that's a real terms cut. Yeah? Now, learning support received $395 million. Now, learning support used to be known as special needs. Yeah? It's really valuable spending. It's stuff we should absolutely be doing. It's the fastest growing area of need in education. Yeah? No complaints from me about spending. Yeah? But the money for that came from closing Cadlaco lines in our education program, which collectively lost $454 million. So it's not your money, it's just money moving away. And when we look at health funding, because I'm an economist, I can always make things worse, right? So we look at how much money the health service needed on a per person basis, adjusted for inflation, just to stand still, yeah? Which is that blue line at the top. And then we look at how much did they actually receive, which is the orange line below. Across the 2 years, there has been effectively a $240 per person cut in health funding in the country. You're now currently $50 per person behind, where you should be just to keep the lights on. No meaning to add any more services. And by the way, none of this accounts for what we call demographic change. Right? Demographic change means we need more money because we have more elderly people. Right? We have people who have more needs. Disabled people live longer, which is great. Yeah? But that means you've got to put more money in just to stand still. As a consequence, we're not even standing still. We're actually falling further behind. And then education received $433 million of new funding at this package. Right? But there's no money for actually any new teachers. The number of teachers is exactly the same as the last one. And all of the non-education package is meant to be this establishing a plan for the extra teachers program, this establishing resource teachers on roles, and exactly what that means, redirecting unallocated funding from the manual funding to small provision growth initiative. Now, I can't tell you how much I'm a white guy from Newcastle. Right? When I used to work in the Beehive and I used to get asked for money for market development or other programs, I used to say to people, I'm a white man desperately trapped inside the body of another white man. Right? And I have no idea what you're asking for. Even I can tell you that is a Treaty of Waitangi tribunal claim waiting to happen. We have a responsibility as a country to make sure that we're actually delivering Te Reo. Right? And we're actively cutting the expertise in Te Reo in order to fund other things inside the education system. I can't wait for the budget document done, because the legal advice on this will be redacted, to say the least. So there was some new spending The biggest discretionary spending was $139 million on attendance services. Yeah, making sure your kid's there. Good. Kids should be there. Good. 80% of that is building the national register. So it's not actually buying anything. It's not actually any attendance service. It's the IT build for a national register. So, while you're in a good mood, let's talk about our benefits. Best Start. Does everyone know what Best Start is? Yeah? Payment for the first year for everyone, then second year, third year. Yeah? That's not going to be means tested for the first year. Usually everyone needs to get it for the first year. $72 a week. Yeah? Now, if you're a couple, both working full-time minimum wage, you now can't get Best Start. Right? So the number of families, because currently it's about 60, we have about 60,000 live births in the country every year. We'll knock about 55,000 of them out by means testing it. And 18 and 19-year-olds will now be financially supported by their parents because we're getting rid of job seeker support for 18 and 19-year-olds. Around $1 billion in welfare savings are to be found from AI, automation, and data matching. Yeah? If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. Alright? Because that is what is penciled in the budget. Historically, these things have never found the savings that have been promised. And they often actually end up costing more money, because we spend a lot of money on the IT, and never actually found any savings. In fact, we just often discover that we needed to pay more money out at the end of the process. The working family changes, lift the income threshold to 44,900, right? The full-time minimum wage is $48,880. So someone on a full-time minimum wage working for families. So someone on the full-time minimum wage now will be able to claim the full-time, the full working for families claim. And the abatement rate after that goes up, so any dollar that they earn more than that, more and more gets taken away. There's about 44,000 families who will be worse off as a consequence of these changes. But overall, 143,000 families will be better off to the tune of about $7 a week. Now, I know I live in a particularly flash part of Wellington, right? I know well, I'm all right? My local shop, Island Bay and New World, right? I can't buy a block of butter for that $7 a week. Yeah? And it's certainly probably not the cost of living adjustment for any normal family around the country. So those 142,000 families, with some very rare exceptions, will all now be worse off in real terms. And while we talk about strange decisions, there's a great quote from Joe Biden that I love, right? Because I love budgets. Yeah? Joe Biden famously said, "Don't tell me your values. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you your values." Yeah? Because the choices that we make demonstrate our values. Right? So I want you to think about what values the government are making these decisions. We're spending more money for energy for ministerial services, which is ministerial advisors like me, and ministerial travel budgets. Now that's more than all the new money that's being made available to help elderly people out of hospital. Where it goes to rates relief package. So if you've got a gold card or a community services card and you're paying rates, you could claim up to $790 a year in support. That's going up by $15 a year, which means that you'll be able to get 29 cents a week extra support to pay your rates bill. Laser-like focus on the cost of living. My only request is that you don't spend it all in one shot.
What do you buy in the supermarket for 29 cents?
You can't even, these days you can't even buy the paper bag, you know. So, we're spending $31.2 million on more military-style academies, which are boot camps. Do I have time to tell you a very brief story about boot camps? Boot camps, sorry. We had a pilot program, 10 kids in boot camps. Yeah? If that kid lived in Palmerston North, yeah, I could pick that kid up in a limo, stretch limo. I could drive it to Wellington Airport. At Wellington Airport, I could pick that kid up, right? First class, I could fly them, if you really desperately want to know, Air New Zealand, Cathay Pacific, to London Heathrow. London Heathrow, I could pick them up in another limo. I could drive them to Windsor. At Windsor, there's the private school at Eton. I could pay for a full year's subscription at Eton. Just to make sure they didn't feel left out, I could give them $1,000 a week spending money. At the end of the year, I could pick them up in a limo, fly them back home, first class, pick them up in a limo, take them home, and give them a check for $150,000 and we're still better off. That is how expensive this program is.
Is that per child?
Per child.
That's it's a nice story.
Need to get that out there on the phone.
We're spending $31.2 million to really destruction test how stupid this program is. We're providing, if the boot camp doesn't work, it's okay because we're providing $15 million for new private schools. Right? Meanwhile, ECE centres are seeing a 2% real terms cut in their funding. Their grant went up by 0.5% this year. There's a 6% increase in tuition fees this year, on top of the 6% increase in tuition fees last year, and the threshold for repayments for student loans is being frozen, this is Treasury's language, indefinitely. So that means every year when inflation goes up and wages go up, a little bit more of that goes into your student loan payments. So that's $65 million the Crown have interpreted for, thank you very much, taken from the pockets of students who just left university. And for anybody who rents, you have to put your tenancy bond, the Crown holds your tenancy bond. Yeah? And if you rent, the Crown looks after that, and because the Crown looks after it, it basically buys its own debt with your tenancy bond. Yeah? So we make money out of it, it's interest. Right? Because interest's been high now, right? We've clipped $180 million more than we were expecting in that fund. Right. So you'd think that would be spent on homelessness programs, or tenancy inspections, or the tenancy tribunal service. Yeah? Nope. Crown's went, that belongs to me now. Thank you very much. During these difficult times, we thank you for your contribution. And again, let's talk about KiwiSaver. So KiwiSaver, the KiwiSaver contribution is on the rise to 4% for employers and employees, right? And the Crown's contribution, which was $520, is now going to fall to $260. Back in the day, it was $1,000. Yeah. Now, $3 billion is saved as a consequence of that cut from the government across the next 4 years. Yeah? But for a minimum wage worker, if they were 18 when they started and 65 when they left, and they paid 3% or then 4% across the 4 years period, just that one decision alone cuts $81,600 from their final KiwiSaver. Now, tall, handsome white economists like me will be okay, right? Because our KiwiSaver balances are much bigger. Yeah? But if you're a minimum wage worker, that KiwiSaver contribution from the Crown is a much bigger part of your final KiwiSaver balance. Yeah? It's amongst the most regressive ways of doing this. It impacts the low paid the most. Instead of people like me paying more, or instead of me testing it, we instead just said, let's cut it for everyone. And as a consequence, those on very low incomes, they face the sharpest cut. And I'm not going to test your eyesight with this, but the Treasury produces a little box inside the budget economic and fiscal book called the economic impact of changes to KiwiSaver. We have assumed that employers will offset the majority, 80%, of their higher contributions via lower than otherwise wage increases. So your employer's not going to pay because they're going to put that KiwiSaver increase into your wage increases. Yeah? So you're going to pay for it twice. The Crown's not going to pay. In fact, the Crown's taken $3 billion out of it. So now you can imagine, if you're having to find essentially 2% more of your income via that mechanism, what are the incentives for low-income workers to just take themselves completely out of the KiwiSaver system? And again, it's enormously regressive. So, let's talk about pay equity. $12.8 billion, and I'm advised legally to use this term, essentially, is stolen from low-income, female-dominated workforces. there are 180,000 workers with active claims that have just been cancelled. Overall, including the 5 active claims that have been settled, there are 350,000 workers who are affected by this change. They lose about, on average, about $30,000 each. Life-changing sums of money. Now, $11 billion of that is being used for day-to-day spending, and $1.8 billion is being used for capital spending. Right? So it's not even as if it's being used to then buy something new. It's just being used to keep the lights on. And the reason it's being used to keep the lights on is because the government stuffed its accounts when it did the tax cuts in 2023. It made a giant mess of them. The accounts were in a much worse place. The economy didn't grow as they predicted. And as a consequence, they needed to find money fast. As a consequence of you've got 2 choices when you work in the beehive, right? You can either be honest, and you can say we stuffed the accounts, we made a mistake, mea culpa, right? Or you can steal somebody else's money. I've lived in New Zealand for 13 years, right? This is singularly the most cowardly political act I've seen in the 13 years I've lived here. Because rather than being honest and just say, we stuffed the numbers, terribly sorry, right? Debt's going to go up a bit, who cares, right? We chose to take away pay equity from low-paid, female-dominated workforces. And take away their income, not just now, for the rest of their lives.
The US did something similar in the tax cuts in 1981 when they screwed up and then decided to go after the Social Security to cover that.
Yep. We had to develop.
Didn't understand that at all.
So it was around then we had the development of the social, the sort of the media phenomenon, the welfare queen, and the idea that we were suddenly going to chase all these people, right, who were rorting the system, and the fact that Reagan couldn't add numbers together without puppets, right, was right same problem. And of course, this pay equity change is on top of other employment law changes we've seen in the first, in the first half of this term. Right? Moving pay agreements, contractor reforms, proposed changes to sick leave, protections for living wage and government contracts being removed, cutting the minimum wage in real terms for 2 years in a row, bringing back many trials, pay reductions of partial rights and moving access to personal grievance claims. And that's before we do things like health and safety, which are currently on the cards as well. Because apparently we don't kill enough people in this country yet. We've got to make it an education program. By the way, we kill approximately 17 workers a week as a consequence of their work in this country. Every 15 minutes we injure a worker so badly they have to spend a week away from work. By the time I finish talking to you, 3-4 workers will have been injured. So badly they've got to spend a week at work. That's 5 times the death rate of the UK, with basically the same legislation. But the problem is education, not enforcement, apparently. And so what's the message of this budget? What's the thing you can take away? Essentially, the government doesn't understand the problems facing New Zealand. It's tackling investment. That's not the problem. Right? It's tackling welfare fraud. That's not the problem. Parents will apparently welcome financially looking after their 18 and 19-year-olds. And I put that up there because those are the exact words of the Minister of Finance. Mikey Sherman, I was in the lockup, Mikey Sherman, TV1, said, what do you say to the parents of 18 and 19-year-olds you're going to look after, say you're going to pay for yourself? And she said, I think parents will welcome the opportunity to look after their children, get them off the couch, get them off the PlayStation and get them into a job. It's not very often when you're in the sort of the theaterette where they do the lockup, but the entire place takes a collective, like, did she say that? But yeah, apparently parents will welcome looking after their 18, 19-year-olds. Taking away government KiwiSaver contributions, according to the press release, is an opportunity for low-income families to save more. And my own personal favourite, the name of the press release that sets out cuts to the best out payments for 60,000 babies is called Increased Support for Families. We are through the looking glass in terms capital-intensive businesses who will get a tax cut, social media companies who will be forced to pay a tax, car dealers who will be getting more money heading towards them, film studios, private medical firms who will be able to make more money, and AI firms who will be promising MSD fortune saved if they just spend a lot of cash. Now, if you were setting up, let's imagine, just think there's a little thought experiment, right? Let's assume you were setting up a government from scratch, right? You found a new country. You're going to establish a government from scratch. Who would you establish that government to protect, to look after? Yeah? Would it be families, female workforces, children's lives, and workers, public services, or the environment? Because those are all the big losers in this budget. There isn't a cent for climate change in this budget. There's not a cent to support the environment. We are actively taking away protections for workers in order to make them more competitive. But they're all the losers at this budget. And if you take nothing else away from today, please just take this. Everything that we do in economics is a choice. Nothing is natural. Right? The Treasury is very keen to make sure it writes down, and it forces you to make choices about everything. Yeah? When you write a budget, you get this, I still have nightmares thinking about it, you get these A3 pieces of paper, right? With every budget piece, every line. Yeah? And it's written in font 8. Right? So you have to read it through a magnifying glass. Right? And you have to say yes, no to literally everything. All the time. We're making choices. Other choices were available, other choices could deliver, could actually tackle child poverty. We're missing every single one of our child poverty targets right now. And we're going to miss them by a crucial amount. Legally mandated child poverty targets in the Child Poverty Reduction Act 2018, signed off by every political party with the exception of ACT. Different choices were available. And because I like numbers, can I leave you with one final number? It's a particularly important number to me. Something that makes it, I think you should all be thinking about it. There are 498 days to the next election. That's my guess, 1st of November 2026. A government gets roughly 1,000 days in office. Yeah? We're about halfway through this term. The damage the government's done in the first half of this term, I don't want to live in this country if we put another one in front of that number. Right? Because the damage won't be repairable. Right? So we've got 498 days to tell the country about the damage that's being done to communities, workforces, families, as a consequence of the choices that this government's making. Other choices that could be made. We've got 498 days to communicate that, because I want you to take away a lesson from the last election. Crime. At the last election, crime was the second most important issue to voters when they were putting their X's in their boxes. Crime over the past 10 years in New Zealand, more than rejected. It doesn't matter which party's in office, it's just been falling rejected. Yeah? That's the point of that. Right? Young people, I'm youth adjacent. Young people are boring. They don't take drugs, they don't drink, they don't get pregnant, they don't commit crime anywhere near the rate they used to when I was young. I'm not saying I'm personally responsible, right? But as a consequence, youth crime has been falling even more steeply than crime generally. Yeah? At the last election, you would have believed there was a crime wave taking over the country. Ram raids were on the TV every day. There was a moral panic about we must have the smack and firm government. People have to go to prison for longer. Yeah? That's because the Nats spent 18 months relentlessly banging on about crime. We've got to pay them the ultimate political compliment. Yeah? We've got to steal that. What are our issues? And how do we spend 18 months banging on about them so at the next time we people in the ballot box and put the pen and then hover over the little squares? What's the issue we want in their head? Health, education, housing, jobs, a better income. Yeah? Better environment. We've got to have those things, and we've got to spend that 18 months, right, between now and then, every time we get the chance, talking about the choices that I'll stop gassing there. Thank you all so much for listening. Happy to take any. And I apologise if I've just thoroughly depressed you. Happens.